Hello, everyone. Welcome again to International Humanistic Management Association's Research Seminar Series. Today, we are excited to have Ashley Whillans with us as a presenter. Her talk is entitled Rethinking Workplace Wellbeing Interventions. But before we get to that, I'll introduce myself briefly and also Michael and Kristen Lucas, who are in the audience. I'll ask them to introduce themselves too. My name is IHMA. I'm an assistant professor of organizational behavior at Fordham University and a research affiliate with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. And my research is on leadership and human flourishing broadly. We would like to take a couple minutes just to use the chat and for you to introduce yourself. Please leave in the chat your name, your university or institution, and your key research topics, please, so we can get to know each other and understand who is in the audience. And in that time, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself and say a couple of words? I know, Kristen, you're in the audience too, whenever you're comfortable.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good night, good evening. Aisha, thank you so much. Ashley, thank you so much for being here. My name is Michael Pearson. I'm based at Fordham University, and I'm also affiliated with the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. My research is on what I call humanistic management, which is sort of dignity and well-being or flourishing. Not only in the context of work, but in the general context. And I think that management as capital M management is something that we do anywhere in life, not just in the business world, but how we manage and lead our lives. I think that's sort of what I'm interested in. So with that, I turn it over to Kristen. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Lucas. I'm a faculty member at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, USA. So greetings from our gray sky here in Kentucky today. My research is on workplace dignity, broadly construed, which fits very nicely with that framework of humanistic management. And within that area, my particular focus has been on issues of social class, and particularly how individuals at lower levels of economic hierarchies are particularly negatively impacted in their pursuits of dignity.
Thank you so much, Kristen and Michael. We're kind of organizing these events together. And I want to talk briefly about how the structure of the talk will go. We will have 30 minutes of Ashley's talk, hear from her research, and then leave the last 30 minutes of this hour for question and answer and conversations about her research going forward. And with that, I would like to introduce, you can use the chat anytime you want, write your questions there. I think more people will be coming in as we are kind of progressing. But I would like to briefly introduce Ashley Whillans to you. She is a longtime collaborator of mine and a mentor for me throughout my PhD. I had the blessings of working with her. And so it's particularly exciting for me to have her here today. So Ashley Whillans is an associate professor at the Harvard Business School. Her research expertise centers on how resource allocation decisions, including how employees spend time at work and outside of it, contributes to well-being and social connection. She has published in such outlets as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Nature, Human Behavior, Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, and Management Science. She earned her MA and PhD in social psychology from the University of British Columbia. We often have a lot of people from Canada as well. So, all right, wonderful. And with that, Ashley, I'll leave it to you for your talk, and I'll make sure that you are the co-host so you can share your slides with us.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me as part of your session today. I will do my best to keep to time. I hope everyone can see my screen. I think it's showing now. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing looking at interventions to reduce the stress and urgency associated with our always-on work cultures and implications for employee well-being, and then broadly what some of the field research I've been doing kind of says in terms of how we might reimagine or rethink workplace well-being interventions. So I'm going to go through the talk in three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on time stress and unhappiness for full-time working adults living all over the world. I'm going to talk about an ongoing paper that I'm working on related to reducing the stress and overwhelm of hybrid workplace environments. And then I'm going to zoom out to thinking about how we might be able to use the language of S-frame interventions from the behavioral science literature to think more about what we can do to support employees at work and outside of it. So as someone who's trained in positive psychology, looking at how as Michael was saying, management outside of the workplace, capital M management, how we run our lives, impacts our well-being. I'm very interested broadly in how employees can make decisions at work and also how work shapes employees' decisions and how that might impact stress and well-being. So using data from the Gallup World Poll, my collaborators and I have found evidence all over the world that the percentage of full-time working adults who report experiencing a lot of stress yesterday has significantly risen over the past 2 decades. When we look at 2023, the trends continue up and to the right. We see that these trends are especially strong in North America, but persistent really in most regions around the world. And when we look under the hood of these data to try to understand why the percentage of full-time working adults who reported experiencing a lot of stress yesterday has risen, despite the fact that during this period of time, the gross domestic product or the wealth of nations has largely risen as well, we see that work-related demands are a strong predictor of these rising rates of time stress. People feel pulled trying to keep up with the demands of work and personal life. In a systematic review that my colleagues and I published a few years ago, we looked across literatures, economics, social psychology, public health, management, and found that this subjective experience of time stress, holding constant objective work hours, was a significant, unique negative predictor of a host of well-being related outcomes that individuals, organizations, and societies care about. People who felt more chronically overwhelmed by the demands of work and life reported lower job satisfaction, lower work-family satisfaction. They were less satisfied with the breaks they did get away from the office. They were also rated as less creative, but objectively by their managers, which put them at a disadvantage for subsequent promotions. And individuals who reported feeling overwhelmed by the demands of work and life on a chronic basis were also more likely to become divorced in the 10-year, kind of like preceding 10-year period. So we can see again that these subjective feelings of being overwhelmed, stressed, contribute to ill-being, not only for individuals, but also organizations and societies. When looking at how COVID has accelerated so many trends, both positive and negative, we see that time demands have increased. This feeling of kind of being overwhelmed has increased during COVID, and we can see that in a couple of different ways. So my colleagues' research conducted with Microsoft analyzed data from 3 million workers in 16 global cities and found that the average workday during COVID expanded by about the amount of time that people used to spend commuting to the office. They also showed that the day was more fragmented in time because of constant email and calendar distractions, which can pull people out of the present, make it hard to focus, and elongate the workday. We also, in a paper that Aisha and our colleague Laura published in 2021, we saw that these time demands created by the COVID-19 pandemic were not equally distributed in the employee population. So looking at over 30,000 employees across 5 countries, we observed that working women completed significantly more chores and childcare as compared to working men in 2020, even controlling for employment status, whether that individual was a primary breadwinner, and so on and so forth. And we saw, just kind of extrapolating our regression coefficients, that this really resulted in women doing 12 more days of chores and childcare in 2020 as compared to working men, and higher chore burden undermined women's self-reported well-being. These trends have persisted not in our data, but from others, showing that flexible workplace policies result in unequal distribution of labor in the home, with women using that flexibility that hybrid work affords to take on more of the chores and childcare on average as compared to working men. So when we kind of see this COVID-related technological acceleration of digital distraction and workplace demands, potentially creating an even more stressful and time-stressful environment, especially for knowledge workers, which will be the focus of my field experimental data. I also have research looking at time poverty among those struggling to make ends meet and would be happy to chat about that. But for the purpose of this presentation, my field experiment is with tech workers. We know that an increased volume of meetings and emails can make it hard to find focused time to complete deep work. And this constant connection to technology like email and instant message can limit attentional focus needed for challenging tasks. My colleagues also have experimental research linking constant connection to technology through digital channels like email and instant message to causal increases in stress and causal decreases in well-being. So we can see from this evidence that one factor that might be contributing to these feelings of overwhelm are being constantly pulled in many directions by our digital devices. And these trends seem to have accelerated since the COVID-19 pandemic. There's clearly a need in the knowledge worker community for breaks away from our devices as a mechanism to try to get more focused time and feel less overwhelmed by trying to do it all and perform at a high level, both at home and in the workplace. You can see that companies like Slack have focused Fridays and Maker Weeks to try to give back knowledge workers some of that time that they need to innovate at the workplace, but also to recharge and rejuvenate outside of the work. Despite the fact that these strategies have emerged since the COVID-19 pandemic, it's also possible that these strategies might be largely ineffective. So encouraging knowledge workers not to interrupt each other, to do quiet time, to get heads down time, to try to manage digital distraction, reduce stress, and improve perceived control over time should theoretically predict greater well-being, greater feelings of control over time. Yet we also know, because of research in the organizational behavioral literature, that we use constant responsivity, emailing right away, getting back to someone right away, as a signal of commitment in workplaces. So while past research has explored the possible benefits of these kinds of focused time interventions in hypothetical settings or using correlational designs and found some success, it's possible that in a workplace where there's strong norms to respond right away, to signal our commitment, to signal that we care the most about our jobs, especially in these high performing knowledge work areas where it's harder to discern what objective criteria for performance looks like, it's possible that employees might not kind of uptake these interventions because they want to signal commitment right away by responding instantaneously. So this makes it an interesting and open question as to whether time management interventions like focused time strategies can improve the employee experience, given this strong impetus to respond instantaneously. We know that these interventions could be beneficial. However, again, as I mentioned, most research in this space is lab-based, correlational, or not pre-registered. So in the field experiment that I'm going to present briefly, we looked at whether these time management interventions, when implemented on teams of knowledge workers, might reduce perceived time stress and improve subjective well-being. More broadly, this links to a larger question, which is, if we spend almost 80,000 hours at work, can we use psychologically informed interventions to improve the experience of work with potential consequences for well-being more broadly? So just from a conceptual perspective, this intervention, based on my past research, I proposed might reduce the perceived burden of interruption, increase perceived control over time, reduce time stress, and improve well-being for knowledge workers. I also explored the impact of a focused time-related management intervention on collaboration, satisfaction, connection, and self-reported productivity. The field setting of this experiment was a hybrid workplace. It's a top technology company which has less than a 1% acceptance rates for hiring, highly competitive, and also very subject, because it's a publicly traded company, to the market volatility. So employees there know that they're kind of walking on like thin ice all the time to show their top performance to each other and to deliver at their highest and best ability at all times to keep their positions in the companies. The hybrid workplace policy in the organization that I worked with at the time that I studied it was 3 days in the office. Employees could apply to work from other offices or work remotely. So this was coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And employees could work from another office up to 4 weeks per year. Note that these remote options were less utilized at the period of time in which our field experiment was conducted. It was becoming less normal to work remotely. About 10 to 20% of the employee population were working under these remote policies at the time that the study was run. This used to be an entirely office-based organization, FaceTime heavy culture pre-pandemic. And what we can see from this data now is that there's actually a great dispersion in the organization now. So they gave me access to all of their HR data, so I could see where all the teams that we were studying were located in the entire organization, not just the ones in the experiment, but what did the organization look like at the time that my field experiment was run. And we can see it's kind of a highly co-located, a highly dispersed organization. Only about 20% of the workforce of this entire company was entirely co-located, where their team sat in the same building, in the same office. And that's in stark contrast to the previous reality where 100% of teams used to be co-located. We also saw from internal data that the company shared with us that the same challenges and demands I laid forward in the first part of the talk were also experienced by knowledge workers in this setting. So the majority of employees in this organization said that they often had to work outside their preferred office or working hours, and they didn't feel in control of their time. This is why the organization wanted to work with me as an outside researcher to try to help these knowledge workers come up with interventions that could help them reduce this digital distraction, reduce the demands of work and life, because they were seeing in their workforce how tired everyone was, constantly juggling these geographic distributed teams that they didn't used to have to manage, constant digital distraction and fragmentation. And these numbers, from my understanding, had significantly increased post coming back to the office after COVID. Although they didn't share all of that data with me. Employees in this organization think of focus time and having time to get their heads down work done, like all of us as knowledge workers, as productivity. So individual contributors in this organization, you could think software engineers, highly technical individuals, really were prioritizing trying to get their individual work done. So they really prioritized in our qualitative interviews that we did prior to the experiment that they really didn't count internal meetings as presentations as productive work, but really they thought that the time that they spent working on decks or working on data was what they constituted as productivity. When we did a daily diary study to look at kind of how to set up this experiment, what we can see, this is a bit of a busy graph, so I'm not going to get into it, but in a lot of detail for the sake of time. But really what we see is that employees really needed to spend about 20, you kind of can see the biggest rise in the percentage of feeling productive when employees went from having no focus time, 0 to 20% focus time, to 21 to 40% of focus time. And yet you didn't seem to lose a lot of the connection benefits if you just kind of focus on getting at least 21 to 40% of time. So, you want to have some time spent in meetings, you want to have some time spent in productive time. So we were trying to get individual employees to have at least 20%, 21% of their time with heads down time during the day. So we can see that employees felt more productive when they spent about 20% of their time or 2 hours on focus work, those individual tasks. And there was the largest marginal increase for productivity and connection when increasing focus work from 0 to 20% to 21 to 40%. So to set up the experiment, we recruited 210 managers, or about 1,800 employees, to be randomly assigned to one of two conditions, Group A or Group B. Everyone did the intervention, but Group A did it first, and then Group B participated afterwards. So it's a holdout design, which allowed for random assignment, but also enabled me to run this experiment in a corporate context. Teams were asked to complete one 15 to 30-minute norms discussion, one 15-minute norms check-in about halfway through the experiment, and we had about 800 people complete the surveys, which was there was no statistical difference on who completed the surveys based on observable characteristics that I had, and those response rates were pretty comparable to other surveys in the organization. So you can see at the experimental design, Group A got a baseline survey and a week 7 endline survey. They completed a norms conversation. I'll show you the instructions in a second in week 2. At week 4, they did a quick midline survey. And then at week 5, they did a team check-in conversation. You can see that Group B, I have some intake measures to allow me to test whether there were group A and group B were balanced before the intervention was implemented. For the purpose of the presentation today, I'll be comparing week 7 of group A and group B. Controlling for week 1 of group A and group B. We can run the analysis in different ways, stack the groups on top of each other, and the results look statistically similar. So the actual intervention itself, teams were asked to have a 15 to 30-minute conversation to set one of these norms meant to reduce the digital distraction of working on highly interconnected teams. They could either designate team focus time, limit after-hours communication, or avoid weekend work. We chose these from best practice management research on time management interventions. Now, I'm particularly interested in whether any time management intervention can produce these positive subjective benefits. I'm not, I have been focusing on focus time. These all kind of focus on the blurry boundaries between work and home. We wanted to make sure to give employees choice over which norms so that they would actually do it, because some of the teams had some of these norms already. It does, if you were very interested in focus time, you might argue that I broke random assignment here by letting teams choose. But I think for the purpose of implementation, it was very important to give some employees some choice over what norms their teams would implement. The majority chose the focus time intervention. A smaller minority did limiting after hours communication, such as by setting norms to call if it was urgent, but otherwise to not expect a response after 5 p.m. And only about 10% selected avoiding weekend work by avoiding Monday team meetings. So it's just a little bit more detail here for anyone who's interested. But again, these were taken from other published research on this topic. We pre-registered looking at well-being, and so subjective well-being and work-relevant experience measures. We had positive mood, negative mood, stress, productivity, time control, connection, and collaboration satisfaction. I was interested in the perceived burden of interruption, and I was also interested in whether adherence moderated the results. So this is the extent to which the teams actually had the norm-setting intervention and checked in partway through the experiment. And I had objective team dispersion data, so whether teams were in the same office building, how geographically dispersed they were, how many time zones were between them, how large they were. We used project-based teams based on the recommendation of the organization that these were the ones that mattered most for collaboration. We also looked at what norms the teams chose. It's worth noting that that didn't impact any of the results significantly, so I'm not going to talk about that in more detail. We ran a pre-registered analytic plan, which I can talk about in more detail, but really, again, we're just interested in whether setting these team intervention norms that were designed to reduce the digital distraction and collaboration overload of hybrid work could improve self-reported positive outcomes for individuals on teams that were highly interconnected. In this pre-registered plan, we didn't see much in the way of our kind of direct effects on positive mood being supported, and I'm going to get into some nuance as to why that is. We did see that those who did the time management intervention, so group A compared to group B before group B actually participated in the study, experienced higher levels of team connection and were less burdened by others' interruption, or the perception of interruption was less burdensome for individuals on these teams. The connection piece was unexpected and nice. So it seems like one side benefit of these interventions is it gives teams the opportunity to come together to talk about something other than work that's personally meaningful to them. So that was a strong and surprising result. We saw that just as an illustrative example of some of the items in our burden measure, we saw that those who completed the intervention said that they reported less work-related interruptions, and they felt more comfortable saying no to requests that came through their inbox. So this time management intervention seemed to be creating positive norms for individuals on teams where they felt like they could actually push back against some of the constant digital distraction that was happening throughout the day. Looking at an indirect effect model, the extent to which the intervention reduced the psychological burden of interruption. This in turn helped individuals on these hybrid teams feel more in control of their time, which in turn predicted greater positive mood. Now, please note this is just all correlational, but it does suggest at least that the extent to which it does suggest kind of that the perceived burden of interruption and perceived control over time did matter. And the extent to which the intervention predicted those variables, the intervention in turn was able to predict some of the more distal positive mood benefits, although those were weaker and there's no main effect there. Strikingly, adherence was a very strong predictor of the benefits of the intervention. So the extent to which individuals on these teams said that their team adhered to the norm, discussed the norm, followed the norm, predicted all of these benefits. So really unlocked the benefits if teams were able to actually follow through and do the intervention, which makes a lot of sense. This was true whether we asked about following the norm, discussing the norm. And you can see if teams had no norm conversations, they actually felt lower control over their time if they were assigned to the intervention conditions, suggesting that trying but then failing to actually engage in one of these interventions was worse potentially than like not having tried to do it at all. They had both norm conversations. They reported greater feelings of control over time. So a critical question emerges from these data, which is which individuals and which teams were more likely or less likely to follow the norms that they set. So we saw that larger, more distributed teams were less likely to follow the norms that they set, and employees themselves who reported greater difficulty detaching from work at time one reported a greater change in workloads, so their workloads went up over time, and who worked outside of their preferred hours reported more challenge in following these norms and therefore reaped less benefit. So takeaway here is that employees and teams who could have benefited the most from these kinds of interventions were the least able to capitalize on the benefits of these interventions. And this is going to be linked to this broader kind of argument that some of my co-authors and I are seeing in the data and sort of arguing. So we see that setting norms in calmer periods could help to improve intervention efficacy. And it's unfortunate here, but basically we're not seeing a lot of main effects because the teams who could have benefited the most are the least able to follow through with this intervention, which is a pretty light touch intervention that teams wanted. And this links to this kind of broader point that I think is important and is emerging in the literature that my colleagues and I have been surveying. So we conducted a systematic literature review on workplace well-being interventions and kind of looked at what the efficacy was of these interventions, and we just published this article. And so I think the findings sort of speak to this bigger picture that's emerging in the data. Companies spend about $95 billion a year on workplace well-being initiatives, resilience training, time management training. They hire people like me to give advice, mindfulness, providing virtual therapy. And unfortunately, these kinds of interventions are not widely used. So in our systematic review of the literature on workplace initiatives, only 68% of employees do not fully use their well-being resources because they're too time-consuming, confusing, or cumbersome. Coming out of the field data, I think it's interesting even, one of my colleagues said, well, you gave your knowledge workers a lot of choice, right? And so this choice, actually, you thought of it, me, as a resource, right? We often think about providing individuals with choice, providing them with autonomy as a resource. In the case of being a very busy, overwhelmed professional, it might have actually been a demand as opposed to a resource. In my time management intervention, providing choice over the intervention, choice over how to discuss and debate it, might have seemed like a good idea to encourage buy-in, but might have created friction that made it hard for the teams who could have stood to benefit the most from following through. Similarly, in some of my case research and practical research, and this review as well, suggests that providing employees with a menu of options, giving them a lot of volition to choose to do these programs if they're able to, can maybe leave out the very people for whom might need an incentive or blocked off designated time to complete these kinds of interventions because they are already so overwhelmed in the first place. In our review, we also found that many of these workplace well-being initiatives targeted at the individual level actually showed no impact of these programs on employee well-being over time. And in part, offering some of these initiatives can overlook root causes and even be seen as hypocritical. In one example from another field experiment that we ran with management consultants, we were doing a qualitative ethnography, trying to encourage the use of time blocking and intentional collaboration practices in a very high stress, high performing team. And they said no amount of time blocking, like no offense, researchers, but no amount of time blocking is going to solve the fact that there should be 10 consultants on this project and we're only staffed to have 2. So when the projects are systematically over scoped and understaffed, offering resources, research suggests, can actually be seen as hypocritical. So this is some of the research that's come out, not ours, other researchers looking at this idea of care washing. And there's been research in PhD programs showing that if busy graduate students are told that they could use the well-being resources available to them when they talk to their advisors or other employees about feeling stressed and overwhelmed, this creates frustration and stress, because it's seen as not addressing the root cause issue, which is low wages and overwhelm or overwhelming schedules. And a lot of the individual solutions lack leadership involvement. So as part of our review, most clients reported not following best practices like collecting employee feedback or tracking metrics. So I think when we're thinking not only at my own micro level of trying to get these kinds of interventions to work in the field, but more broadly, how to think about supporting employees in the workplace, it's important, I think, and obviously this is something you all think a lot about as well, to move toward a more holistic approach. We argue in this article that we need to think about responding to employee needs with organizational changes and creating structural supports that make flexibility and well-being possible. This is something that you see successfully in some organizations with the implementation of the 4-day work week or results-oriented workplaces, where instead of telling the individual to manage their time differently, you change the structure of work such that their time has to be managed differently to get work done. So part of the success of the 4-day work week in the organizations that I've studied it in is that when it's working, it creates organizational change because work cannot get done in the same way to create that 4-day work week. It's also important to build well-being into performance metrics and rewards. People are rewarded or do rather what we measure and reward for. It's also important to create support systems. So we've seen in some of the 4-day work week initiatives that I've been involved in, the importance of creating pessimist committees to address ongoing concerns. So when implementing these kinds of interventions, instead of ignoring the most loud critics, actually bringing them to the table and having them form pessimist committees to help you see where something might break down or not be implemented can be an important and helpful strategy, as are developing grassroots champion networks and equipping leaders with well-being and hybrid workplace related management skills. So in our HBR, we observed that one organization implemented well-being training to managers and a simple 15-minute training to equip managers with how to talk about well-being in the workplace increased the percentage of employees that said that their managers talked to them about well-being by about 3 times. So just adding simple trainings to managers in already existing infrastructure seems like an important next step for these kind of time management and well-being related initiatives in workplaces, as is testing and scaling these kinds of interventions in the field so we can see what works and what doesn't outside of tightly controlled lab studies. This is just this idea that, no one strategy in an organization is the quote unquote right strategy. Hybrid work can increase satisfaction, but it also comes with trade-offs around constant responsivity and work-life balance concerns. And in our data, we saw hybrid is most satisfying for workers when focus time isn't lost, when they still have interactions with their managers and colleagues when they come to the office, and that there's intentionality around the office. So all of these kinds of workplace management strategies are tools that have trade-offs that need to be managed, not at the individual level, so not leave individuals up to their own devices to try to figure out all the complex coordination costs of flexible and hybrid work, but rather at a more systematic or structural level. So I think I've spent a lot of time in my research, and the workplace kind of literature that I often read thinks a lot about how can we help employees better manage their time? How can we offer employees individual solutions so that they can help themselves become more well. And I want to start asking this other more broader question of how can we create systems that give back time to employees, and how can we create systems that allow employees to thrive, as opposed to encouraging employees or giving employees the responsibility of always having to take action and be autonomous agents of their own change. So with that, I want to say thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ashley. A lot has been packed into half an hour, right? All the research, it must have been difficult to squeeze it. All right, opening the floor to questions.
Yes, Michael, I see Michael's hand.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm driving, time managing myself.
Oh, I think that's be safe, I guess. I'm not sure about multitasking, but while driving, but
No, I think I understand your work as basically time is the lever for well-being, and having time and control is sort of the missed opportunity in some way. So then my question is, uh, you're saying those individual pieces don't necessarily work. The system pieces need to sort of at least complement it. What is your thought about multi-level selection approaches from the evolutionary perspective? That there are sort of holonic approaches, and this may sound too trivial, but I'm just curious, like in what way that literature is sort of informing some of the work on flourishing and well-being that you're doing in
I don't know that theory.
social
So do you
psychology.
mind just overviewing that theory to me in a bit of detail, so that I
Yeah,
can
so
answer your question?
so the basic evolutionary insight is that yes, we exist at multiple levels, and survival and flourishing is a result of how these levels play together, are aligned or not. So in terms of Darwinian natural selection, people often focus on that, but there's group selection, there's sexual selection, and all of those things. And in some way, we're an outcome of that multi-level selection, and we tend to focus on this natural or the one part. And I think in social psychology, well, maybe the relation level or the individual level, as you're describing it for interventions, very prevalent in the context of, yeah, the typical capitalist model, right? And responsibilizing the individual over and above the system, the group, the organization, etc. So I'm just curious if that in any way enters the conversation. And maybe Aisha has another way of putting that research.
Yeah, I'll try to answer your question from the best of my ability, and then maybe Aisha can kind of see if I get there. But so or like to bro, yeah, like I think it's a really interesting question. So I thought a little bit about the fact, I mean, the ideal worker norm in organizations ultimately benefits the capitalist system, right? So like the fact that we are constantly responsive to our emails above and beyond what is happening in our lives, irrespective of how that makes us feel, is sort of like feeding this broader ecosystem, which is perpetuating continuous progress, exponential growth, right? So there is this world in which some of what you're also pushing on is that, and what I see in my work is, again, like it's very hard for individuals themselves to make any of these changes in a meaningful way for their own well-being. And you can think of this from time poverty too, because we talk about the kind of systematic levels, like the factors that are pushing against individual time affluence and happiness. And there's a lot of them, right? It's like long commutes and the capitalist model and technological acceleration. And so that's why I think it is, I mean, it's appealing to this individualistic narrative that people like to hold of themselves as being free actors. So there's something kind of that are selected for at the individual level to want to seem like we're agents of change in our own lives, that makes these individual level strategies sort of appealing. Yet yet likely ineffective, especially in North America, where we kind of prioritize essentialism and we believe like everyone should be able to get the life they want if they just work hard enough for something, including a life of leisure or like a good work-life balance or something. And so at the individual level, these kinds of interventions are appealing. Yet at the systematic level, they are likely, you know, like it makes sense why they're not effective, because the entire capitalist system is sort of pushing against this idea we should be able to take breaks away from work. And then the capitalist model is sort of like contingent on all of us slaving ourselves away to work at all the time and any time. Like the BlackBerry was supposed to free us from the office, and instead now we take our offices in our back pockets, right? And so from a system perspective, like what's the evolutionary imperative of this kind of conversation is, well, the system is going to need to change, and maybe what success of the system is defined as might need to change too. And so some of what we're talking about is also how do you need to reward and measure progress in a different way, right? So up until this point, yes, like productivity and profit maximization and the maximum output per employee has been the kind of cultural, like the imperative or the evolutionary imperative of organizations of late stage capitalism. And now, like, if we actually want these things to change, we might need to say, hey, workplace well-being is actually the metric we're going to look at from a organizational sustainability perspective. And so there has been some movement in the US system to start to reward and recognize and publicly report on workplace well-being and retention and turnover. And so it's an interesting question, right? So maybe these kinds of organizations that put employee well-being at the center don't look the same in terms of productivity, but maybe if we move to a different model of how to evaluate what organizational success looks like, then they might be faring better in the long run. But that's sort of where a paradigm shift in the way that we think about what productivity and success looks like in society is needed. So I'm not sure if that kind of addresses what you were thinking about, but it's at least how I think about these kinds of individual and system level, and what kind of organizations might be successful under this new model might just look very different and might look different in the long run versus the short run.
Yeah. No, perfect. Thank you so much. And I do think that we're sort of trying to compensate at the individual level what we're not able to put in place at the superseding level, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's we talk about this too, like you have to start somewhere, but it's like maybe we've focused so much attention at the individual level that we're setting up this false expectation that it's possible for individuals to take on this work themselves. And I think there's kind of this critical movement happening where people are sort of like, I can only sort of walk in the opposite direction on this like moving like escalator for so long before I get tired and I just need to get off completely. And I feel like we're kind of, at least in some of the spaces I'm in, it's like we need to actually just step off of this like system now, because all of these things that we're trying to do, looking around, walking in the opposite direction of the system, are too difficult for any individual or any small group of individuals to take on themselves without more structural interventions.
I would like to chime into this because I had a related thought, and that's about, like in the.
Oh, sorry, you're cutting out. Can you?
Oh, how is it right now? You hear me now? Okay.
It's a little quiet. I still can't really hear.
Oh, interesting. Maybe, Colleen, you can go ahead.
I can hear you now.
Oh,
It's
you
just
can hear me?
cutting in a
Okay.
little bit. Yeah.
All right. I don't know what went on there. Maybe laptop is getting out of power. Okay, so what I was thinking is in the grand scheme of these interdependencies from the individual to the system level issues, and like so we're all looking for a leverage point, right? Where can we intervene that will be the most effective to turn this thing around, right? What is the lever for transformation? And I'm wondering if you like, I usually think about it as like leadership. Being by leadership, what I mean is people in power, like in positions of management or supervision, having a really important point here because they can intervene on the system as well by their decisions, both individual actions and in the system. So I wonder if you kind of see anything about the role of what type of leaders, what type of people are better, maybe in your case, to setting up these kind of norms, because the norm issue is super important, right? Like who sets the norms? It's people, but also it's potentially people in management roles. So how does it play out? Or did you observe anything in your data about like the kind of leaders that set good or bad norms here?
Yeah, so I would say I'll speak about a few different angles in relation to your question. So the first is that like a lot of this is based on like profit. So in one qualitative example, like we going back to something I mentioned in the talk, we talked to a management consultant. They're like, I can't do any of these interventions. I'm doing the work of 8 people. And so we went back to their partner and we said, if you really want to solve work-life balance, you'll solve how partners are paid. You're paid, you're basically like, your incentive is such to understaff your projects so that you take home more money. So if we change that incentive, then you fix your work-life balance problems. And they didn't want to hear that, right? It's like they almost kicked us out of, they're like, they're happy to like be telling consultants to like just manage their time different. And when we actually get to the root cause of the issue, then they're like, oh, I don't want to hear that though. Like, yes, I understand that's actually probably true, but I don't want to hear that. So like from some of those conversations, we sort of like developed this sphere of temporal control idea, which is, you know, depending on how much freedom and flexibility you have. So the higher you move up in the organization, the more span of control, kind of sphere of influence you have over others, right? So if you're the CEO, you have a lot of decision authority. If you're a middle manager, you have more. If you're like a more junior employee with like 1 or 2 direct reports, you have less, right? And so, you know, your ability to influence others is going to be determined by how many decision rights you have in an organization, which is going to be largely determined by kind of like the incentive structure, profit sharing structure, sort of like voting rights, regulatory frameworks in any organization. So that's sort of like one piece of it, is like how much kind of formal control and like temporal control do you have in an organization? And the more temporal control, freedom, flexibility, results-oriented workplaces, not time-bound, you're going to have more ability to successfully implement these kinds of like time-based interventions. But in terms of like leaders, kind of like what kinds of leader characteristics, it's interesting. So a couple of things kind of follow. So I've done some work on what factors sort of predict whether a CEO does a profit sharing scheme with their lower level employees. You can think that they're actually like sharing the upside with all of their employees. And really it comes down to values. So is this something that a leader values and cares about? I just wrote a case on a bank that has a hybrid and flexible work policy. And they're like one of the only banks in their area that does this. And when you talk to that leader about like why he's doing that, he was like, well, I was inspired by Clay Christensen at HBS, and who said that management is the most noble profession because if you make your employees happy at work, they're going to be happy in their lives, they're going to contribute to society. So there's a lot of like, in terms of like what kinds of leaders sort of like gravitate towards worker well-being and making that like the cornerstone of their business proposition, not like a nice to have, but like something that's in their DNA, really comes down to the kind of leaders that have this more like socially oriented value, that sort of self-transcended generative sort of value instead of motivations, and usually some personal stake in it. And then in terms of like how do you actually implement these kinds of interventions or create norms in organizations? I would say that you have to basically have formal policies. So some of my other research suggests it's like leaving people to their own devices to sort of like come up, like implement these kinds of interventions on their own. Again, the whole system is sort of like working against this being possible and effective. So the most effective interventions that I've seen in workplaces have formal policies. So in one example, formal policies to enable employees to ask for more time on adjustable deadlines at work works much better and is much more equitable than just saying, hey, if you need more time, you can ask. Because under the second model, junior employees, women, Underrepresented minorities don't ask because they don't feel comfortable. They think you're going to judge them as less, and they might get actually judged as less than, or they already feel like they don't belong. And so now I have to ask for the things I need, and that might single me out as being a low performer. So really organizational policies are key. And that has also been true in the context of like email. So like a very effective intervention was when one startup banned employees from emailing during their paid time off and forced them to pay back their paid time off if they were caught emailing. And so it sets like a very strong top-down organizational norm that like we're not going to tolerate this kind of overworking here. That's not the kind of company we are, and we're actually going to make you pay for violating these rules about work-life balance. So I think give it, at least in America, kind of takes like a strong values driven leader, strong norms and enforcements and policies, and less of this kind of like informal communication, which I thought would be more effective, but kind of in thinking more about the systematic pressures pushing against the efficacy of these kind of interventions in modern workplaces, sort of needs to be a little bit of top-down formal policy, values-led leadership, and really embedded in the company of a DNA, or the DNA of a company rather, to get it to work.
That's a great summary. Thank you, Ashley. I want to make sure, Colleen, you have time to ask, and then Naveen.
Thank you. Thank you also for like pointing to there's so much what you've said, but the fact that there are power dynamics that make it difficult for individuals to kind of advocate for themselves. And they might actually, it could be to the detriment of their career as well, or at least a perception of that. I'm wondering if you could point me in the direction, there's two things that I'm interested in. One is anyone or any studies that are looking at job sharing or career track strategies for parents, because the peak earning years and parenting years coincide. You've already talked about the pressures for unpaid work, typically on mothers, and there are reasons, long-term reasons, for the future of the workplace to have very involved parenting. I don't know if it should be intensive parenting, but it seems like short of cloning humans, I don't know how all of it gets done. And it seems like there should be somebody in HR or in think tanks researching that there are probably ways to proactively or innovatively structure jobs and career tracks to account for the fact that I would say many people also choose to be parents. And I'll just, the other piece that I'm interested in, if there's any sort of movement toward organized labor for knowledge workers. So either, and I'll just mute myself. Thank you.
Thanks for those very thought-provoking questions. I don't know anything about job sharing, but maybe if anyone in the call does, put it in the chat window. I will share this paper by Faziotto. It's about physician. So it's a structural intervention. So like you're speaking my language. I'm a dual income mother of a young toddler in a high stress job in like the key years of my profession, while also being in the key years of my parenting and then the key years of taking care of older parents. And I'm like, I became my time poverty study in a person. So this research is an intervention that was run at Stanford Medical School, and they provided time banking to physician professors. So this program is very innovative, and I don't know why more organizations don't do something like this, but they rewarded all of those things that women are more likely to do, but less likely to be rewarded, like mentoring and presenting at other academic institutions, editing students' papers, looking over colleagues' grants. They came up with this long list, and then you could self-report and verify, you had to have someone verify it, that you did those things, and they gave you back they give you credits for time saving. So nannies, grocery deliveries, basically the unpaid household administrator. And they showed a significant benefit pre-post. They significantly reduced attrition of physicians, largely for women, and significantly increased grant success by about $1 million over the course of the intervention. I don't know why I don't see more of that, but that's a great example of a systematic intervention at the HR level that does two things: rewards and values administrative work in the workplace done mostly by women and minorities, the administrative labor, gives it a value, and then gives it back in time. And that is kind of like both, it's like solving some of the systematic time related issues in organizations that are unequally divided. I think this movement around collective action for knowledge workers is fascinating. And I would love if anyone knows anything about that in the chat window. You might want to look into Bridget Schulte's work if you haven't already. She has a think tank called New America. She's a journalist. She writes a lot on these topics. She would be the place I would go to look at it. It's very interesting. My husband's a physician, and he had to threaten with one of his colleagues litigation to get any paid time off after I gave birth to my daughter, because he has no collective action rights because he is non-unionized. And we're in Massachusetts, which is like the most, we have state laws that guarantee paid leave, and yet they didn't allow him to have it. And they had to like act amongst themselves to try to force the hospital to give them the pay they deserve. So I don't know of that, but I think it would be a very powerful proposition, because we often don't think about it for knowledge workers, but we are all being exploited in some way or the other by organizations who think that they can get away with it. And I think that would be very fascinating. So if anyone has any resources on that, I'd love to know as well. Naveen, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Yeah. My question is on, I'm a researcher in workplace spirituality, again, that's the main topic. How do we bring the well-being? As you mentioned, yes, it's not at individual, but at a community level. But I would say, it still come down to the, individual employee. So I just want to know few intervention, what has really worked out at an individual employee, mainly on a personal, mental, and the health interventions. Because it's for me, it's more in the scope of IT employees. When we talk about the white collar, the first profession comes to the mind is IT employees. And as per the Deloitte, India is the maximum supplier, 70% supplier for the IT employee resources. And we see that a lot of 80% is disconnected. A lot of psychosomatic issues. I personally, when I talk, I see that a lot of mental and the physical issues what they undergo. So one intervention, what I want to know is what level of personal mental interventions have been done, and the other one is the leadership style intervention, and the third one is on the cultural. Obviously there is a lot of East versus West cultural differences and the pressure which has when it comes to IT implementation, and gender, man versus woman, woman who has to take multiple roles, has more pressure when compared to men. And technology, obviously, while when we look at this AI implementation, every day we see a new technology, new innovation being done. It's a lot of pressure on an employee who is in AI and also who is non-AI. There is a lot of job cuts which is happening because of AI implementation. And what are those interventions already been deployed and that is working effectively?
Yeah, so these are all great questions. I don't know the answer to some of them, but I can speak to some of what I've seen. You might want to look into, so there's quite a bit on call center research. George Ward has done some work on the productivity impacts of well-being, higher levels of well-being for call center workers. So he might be someone to look into in terms of surveying the literature. From some of what I've seen, things like breaks, things like notes of appreciation, thank yous, that help employees feel seen and heard can be especially effective in these jobs that are routinized, like call center work. It is worth noting that some of these kinds of interventions can be more effective when individuals are left to their own devices. So when they're focused more on individual work. So I have another field experiment I ran with executives that took a similar focus time intervention, and they have much more control over their schedules, much more autonomy. And there you did see the focus time interventions being more successful for well-being and burnout. So you could imagine trying to apply that kind of idea to a call center with mandatory breaks, increasing well-being if you also encourage people to do mindfulness or some small physical activity at their desk. There's been some research out of Slack showing the efficacy of those kinds of break-based interventions for knowledge workers that might be relevant in your context. And then in terms of the AI, I think that's interesting. So I'm doing some research right now, trying to look at causally identify the benefit of using AI supported work versus simply thinking about a routine task in a different way. So I'll get back to you on what our results look like there. And I do think that the financial uncertainty or economic uncertainty around the use of technology is key for predicting stress. So I told you that one of the top 3 predictors of stress is work-related demands. 2 and 3 are economic instability and job stress related to being worried that you're going to lose your job. So anything that an organization can do to talk about how AI is going to supplement versus supplant someone's job is really key. And in terms of trying to help people keep up with technological innovations in the workplace, they're never going to make time unless you give them time to do that. So in a case that I wrote on a big CPG company, they spent millions of dollars on learning and development programs, just hoping that employees would do them. No one's doing them. And then the whole aha of the case is like, oh, we also need to solve like the behavioral and psychological barriers preventing people from doing those trainings that are going to be critical to their success in the organization, because they're running a global operations company and they're busy and overwhelmed and trying to do their job and barely keeping afloat. So if you are going to implement new technologies, it's critical you give employees paid time and reduce any technological barriers to do the training necessary. I think that's been a big unlock in my ongoing research. Is we can't just expect if you build it, people will come. You have to also create the conditions for them to engage with the resources that we develop in a frictionless way.
Yep,
Okay, thank you, very
helpful.
thank you, and we're by the hour, so it was a lot of amazing insights and wisdom packed into this hour. Thank you so much for spending your precious time with us today. We hope it was useful for you. We hope it was useful for the community to learn about this important topic. And this is the end of the research seminar series for this semester, but we will be back right after the holidays. So wishing everyone a happy Thanksgiving and a Merry Christmas, whatever holidays you're celebrating, a happy one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for all the great conversation. Take care.
Thank you.
Yes, the recording will be available.